So let's speak about our logic of our game here. Right now we have the board and we can click on it. There is nothing happens because we have hard coded that the player indicator is Apple logo. And if you remember correctly, once we have Apple logo, we are actually changing the opacity level to make it invisible. So our board, it looks empty at least. So every time our user clicks, remember our game is multiplayer. We have player 1 and player 2. And by default, we're going to set that the player 1 has a X mark and the player 2 has a 0 or O mark. So when the game starts, only the player 1 will be allowed to move first, because usually in tic-tac-toe, the X player is doing the first step. So every time we click on the board, first, we want to make sure that the specific position is not occupied by another player already. So if there is an X here and the user 2 clicks on it, we don't want to overwrite and turn it to O. So once the position is used, we are not going to overwrite the value of it. Then after each move of each user, we are going to block the board for that specific user so he cannot click twice and take extra points there. So one move for each user, and then after your move you have to wait until the other player makes his or her move. Once we click on any cell, we need to check another two things. We need to check if the game has finished and somebody has won. So we basically take all the available moves that the users have done and check after the move we have done if there is a win pattern for the game. And if there is a win pattern, we are going to show notification that the user 1 or 2 has won. And if user 2 has won, then it means user 1 has lost. So we need to inform him that he has lost. And also, we are going to give them an option to restart the game, etc., or the quit game. If there is no winning pattern detected in the game, we want to check the second thing, which is if the game has finished. So if it was draw. So if all these circles are filled and there were no win patterns detected, it means the game has finished because the board is full and it was a draw. Again, we have to notify the user that it was a draw and give them a motion to continue a new game or to quit the game. So only after the two positions are fulfilled, so we check the win position and draw position, and if none of them are fulfilled, we can move on and continue our game so that the other user can continue playing. So the first thing after we understand our logic is also to show the user visually what's going on. Right now, again, as I said, we have hard-coded this Apple logo, but we are going to make this dynamic. So in order to record for us these moves of each user, we are going to create our model that is going to hold our moves in that. So let me click here, Command N, new Swift file, call this model. And also I'm going to right click and new group from selection and call this also model folder. So in our model, we are going to have a struct called move. And this is gonna be codable, conform to codable protocol, because we want to save our move online. So it's accessible by both users in real time. So let's see what our move needs to register. Every time we click on a specific board area, specific square, we need to register a move. So think what needs to hold each move. We need to have an option to show X or 0 or O mark. And we need to know which board index was clicked. so that we can store this information in our database. And also we need to know which user was it. It was the user 1 or it was the user 2 or player 1 or player 2. So let's create is player 1, actually let's put a number here, is player 1 a boolean. So if it was player 1, we are going to show the X mark, and if it was not player 1, so this will be false, we're going to show the 0 or O mark. And we want to know which index our move belongs to. So let's say let port index, it's an integer. Remember, our port contains 9 zero-based array, 0 to 8, and each index has its place, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we want to know which index was ticked. And then finally, we want to return the indicator, which is basically X or O for that specific move. So here, what we need to do is we check if it was the user 1, the player 1, we will return an X mark, otherwise circle. So I will create a variable which will automatically calculate the value of our is player 1 and then return the corresponding mark. So we'll call this indicator, which is a string, because remember, we need a string with the name of our image in order to pass it into our game, which is right here, because we have an image name here. So this will store our image name. And yeah, let's go back to our model. Here we will say return and say is player 1, and we'll say if it is X mark, otherwise we will use circle. And these names you can get from SF symbols. So let me open the SF symbols. And I can so we have this X mark. You can search for it, call X mark or close, and it will give you an option here. Or we can find a circle. If you search for circle, you will have a lot of options. Scroll down. The one we are using is just a simple circle. Let me see. It's the one here. You can just copy the name here, or you can right click and say copy the name, or just remember the name and type it. Make sure you type it as it states here, otherwise it won't be available, and it will just show us that the said image wasn't found, which is system image. So we have X mark and circle. I'm going to close my SF symbols because it's no longer required. And this will be our move. So now every time we click on our board position, we can register this move, and we will be able to show to our user. But before we move there, there is one more thing we want to create here, another object, another struct, and this will be our game in general. So each time we come to our game view from our start game area, from our home view, we need to generate a new game. And the game would have its unique identifier, the IDs of player 1 and player 2. So we want to know who is playing the game. And then the game is going to have array of moves. So each game should have an array containing these 9 moves, available moves in the game. And once we start our game, all these 9 moves, we will create the array, and we will create them with nil object. So all of them are available, but they will be all nil. And every time our user clicks on a specific board object here, we are going to replace the nil object with a move object. So it will be stored inside our game, and our game will be available on our database, and we're going to use Firebase for this. And the game will be available to both users in real time. So whenever there is any change in the game, for example, one of the moves in the array changed, let's say the user clicked here, we need to quickly update our game object so that the other user will be able to receive all the updates and also show to our user that there was a X mark or a Y mark or an O mark, or the game actually has finished. So all this information is stored in our game object. So let's create a struct, call it a game. And of course, this is going to be codable as well because we want to save it into our Firebase. So let's say our game will have a unique ID, which is a string. Then we will have a player 1 ID, which is going to be string as well. Var player 2 ID, again string. And we will var moves, plural, and this is going to be array of move object, but we are going to state that this is an optional. And the reason we are stating is it optional, as I said before, we are initializing our game object with 9 moves and all of them are nil. It's a nil object, but it's already there. So we have an array of 9 nil objects. That's why our move can be a move or it can be a nil object. So the array is there, and let's say index 0, 1, 2 are nil objects, and then the user clicks on this index, which is index number 3. We are going to put a move there, and all other indexes will be nil at that current point. And you will see later on why we are using nil, because it's easier for us to separate the things together, and we have the array there already. Once we get there and evaluate our moves, you will see why is the reason we are using nil there. Apart from player 1 and 2 ID, we need to be able to know which user's turn is currently. So we need to store who has already played and block the board for that user. So in order to be able to do that, we need to keep track of the user that should be blocked in order to make any move. So I'm going to call this block move for player ID, and this is gonna be string. So we are going to store the ID of player that shouldn't be able to make any moves. And finally, we need 2 more things here. If the game is finished, we want to know which player has won. So we will say var winning player ID is a string. So once our game is finished, we are going to update this variable and give the ID of the player that won, so that we can show our notification. So if the user of our game, the player 1 ID matches to this winning player ID, the notification will tell him that he won. And if it doesn't match, and we are going to tell him that he lost. And finally, we need 1 more variable, and this will be called rematch player ID. This is going to be an array of string. And the reason we need this is we want to keep track how many of the players want to rematch the game. Let's say we have a multiplayer game. Obviously, this is tic-tac-toe, it's a multiplayer game, and we're playing online. If, let's say, the game finish, user player 1 won or lost, and then one of the user chooses to rematch the game. We cannot force the other user to start new game, because we want to give him an option to rematch as well. Maybe he doesn't want and he want to quit the game. So if both users click on rematch, so this array will hold the ID of the users that want to rematch the game. So we will check. If this ID has 2 user IDs inside, it means both users want to rematch, and we will reset the game. If it has only one user ID, it means the other one didn't want, so most probably he quit. And after each user quits, we are going to delete the game object and inform the other player who wanted to rematch that his player partner has left the game, and there is no option to wait for him, and he can go out and start a new game. So that's why we need to keep track how many people want to make a rematch or no.